Hello, I want to believe that you're okay and that you're ready for us to continue studying together. So welcome for today's lesson, and today we are going to discuss about the reflex action. Welcome. Now, I want you to reflect on the following happenings. For example, you've been walking in the park, then all of a sudden you see a loose lion charging. What will you do? Another question that I want you to answer on your own is that you wanted to sit down only to realize that there is a nail planted on the chair. What will you do? The last one, you are walking by the garden and then incidentally you come close to stepping onto a sharp thorn that your eyes are able to see only a few seconds. What will you do? I'm sure that by the time you react, you will not have known what was happening before. So those are some of the activities that by studying this section of the reflex action, you will be able to get correct responses or correct answers on what happens in the body. So before we proceed, I have sets of objectives that I want you to pay attention on. Objective number one, by the end of this session, I expect you to be able to explain the term reflex action. Number two, you explain the term a reflex arc. And actually, you should be able to differentiate between a reflex action together with a reflex arc. Then number three, explain the components of a reflex arc. Objective number four, you will be expected to describe simple reflex action, giving appropriate examples. Then number five, explain conditioned reflex action, giving examples as well. And lastly, you will be expected to describe the differences between the two types of reflex actions, that is, simple and conditioned reflex actions. Now, in this session, we may delve into the simple reflex action, then later on we shall deal with a conditioned reflex action. So what is a reflex action? It is a rapid automatic, sometimes you can use the word autonomic, response to a certain stimulus. So in this case, it's rapid. That means that our brain may not be involved. Actually, the brain will be involved later on, a few seconds after a response has been done. So there are two types of reflex actions. Number one, simple, and number two, conditioned. So what is a simple reflex action? As the word goes, it is a single automatic response to a particular stimulus. And therefore, it is the simplest form of reflex and does not depend on learning. So that means that the responses that are exhibited are not controlled by the brain, that is the part of the central nervous system, although the other part of the central nervous system, which is the spinal cord, is greatly involved in this section. So the information or the impulses will be relayed into the spinal cord, but the brain will get the impulse a few a fraction or fractions of seconds after the response has been carried out by respective structures of the body. Now, before we look at the reflex arc, I want to highlight a few examples of simple reflex action. And in this case, we are actually looking at activities that we refer to as involuntary. That is, the brain is not involved, and therefore they occur rapidly or spontaneously. Number one example is the withdrawal of a finger from the hot or sharp object. We shall see the pathway that is followed as the impulse is created, and then the response is done. Then number two is the blinking of the eye when an object passes close to it, and this is very common. Of course, this happens with an aim to protect the internal structures of the eye against mechanical or physical harm. Then the other example is choking. Coughing is another example. Sneezing. And then the most common that is done actually in some of the experiments that to demonstrate the simple actions is the knee jerk experiment, when the knee is tapped. And this one you can try it at home. I will explain how you can do it, and then you see whether the reflex action will be emitted. Then salivation, and the last example is secretion of tears when an onion is cut. If you have an onion somewhere, please cut it and get the feel. So in our objective, we were expected to explain what a reflex arc is. And in this segment, I have some simple description that can help us understand it deeper. A reflex arc is the pathway that is followed by a nerve impulse. So in that case, it means that we shall be required to look at the components that makes up the reflex arc. That is, we will be expected to check on the receptors, then the nerve cells, and the nerve cells, the simplest of the reflex arc, constitutes of the three, that is beginning with a sensory neuron, which relays information into the interconnector neuron, and we said that it is entirely located within the spinal cord. And then the last neuron is a motor neuron, which is connected to the effectors, which brings about expected responses. The effectors could be a gland, or it could be a muscle. So for the gland, it will be stimulated to produce secretions, for example, saliva, hormones, amongst others. For the muscle, it will be stimulated or excited, and therefore contract, bringing about movement at the point. Now, when somebody accidentally touches a hot object, for example, what happens? At the time, from the time at which the stimulus is created, or the stimulus is developed or generated, and then an impulse created within the nerve cell, it is delivered to the central nervous system, that is the spinal cord, until it reaches the effectors through the motor neuron. That forms the basic unit, which we refer to as a reflex arc. Remember, we said that simply it is the pathway that is followed by a nerve impulse as it travels, that is from the time it is generated or created, all the way to the time the response is brought about at the effectors. So we'll be looking at examples here to explain what we mean. Now, in this example that I have here is one for an individual and we have a finger here that is closer to a sharp pricking object. You can be able to see all this. So in the fingertip, there are pain receptor cells. Pain receptor cells. So these receptor cells are able to pick the stimulus, which is pain. Once the stimulus is picked, it is converted into messages that is referred to as impulse by the sensory neuron. Then the impulse will travel along into the spinal cord, and then within the spinal cord, the impulse is delivered into a relay neuron. Relay neuron that is represented by a green color here. So the relay neuron, which is entirely found within the spinal cord, picks up the impulse and delivers it immediately to the motor neuron. And the motor neuron connects with the effector, and this is a muscle. So in the muscle, we expect the muscle cells to contract, and therefore the finger will be withdrawn from. The finger will be withdrawn from the pricking object here. So if you follow that sequence of events, it tells you that an impulse can be created after a stimulus has been brought about. Of course, remember, the stimulus is any factor of the environment that directs a change in behavior of the organism. So the stimulus will be developed within by a factor of environment. Then a stimulus, an impulse will be created, taken to the central nervous system, in this case the spinal cord, and then delivered to the effector for appropriate response. So if you try to follow that path is the one that we refer to as a reflex arc. A reflex arc. Therefore, a simple reflex arc constitutes of 3 neurons: the sensory picking up impulses, delivering them to the relay neuron, and then from the relay neuron it delivers to the motor nerve fiber or motor neuron, which connects with an effector that is supposed to bring about expected response. And the expected response in this case is the contraction of the muscles, the bicep muscles, which enables the pulling off of the finger from the object, which is a sharp prickling material here, maybe a pin or a nail. So in this case, you realize that through such an action, the finger or the cells are able to be relieved of the pain that was subjected by the stimulus here. So meaning that simple reflex actions enables an organism to escape injurious or dangerous stimuli. In this case, we've given pain. So I will continue with the other examples in the next clip.